Hello, everybody, and welcome to School Day at North Texas Teen Book Festival, hosted by the Library Science Program at Sam Houston State University's College of Education. I am Stephanie Galvan Russell. I am a middle school librarian in Austin, Texas at Pflugerville Middle School, and I am a proud alum of Sam Houston State's Library Science Program. Today, I am honored to moderate the Final Fantasy panel and welcome our authors, Karla Arenas Valenti, Darcie Little Badger, and Julian Randall. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is exciting.
So our first, not really question, but I will call each of you and please share a little about yourself, do some shameless self-promotion. I have your books in ebook format, so I don't have them to hold them up, but if you do, that would be awesome. And tell us about your new book and anything you want our viewers to know. So we will start with Karla.
Well, hello, everybody. Hello, book lovers, book readers. My name is Karla Arenas Valenti. I am the author of Loteria. A little bit of background. I am from Mexico, born and raised, and the book is actually based in Mexico as well. It is heavily influenced by all the magical realism that I experienced growing up. I've lived in many countries since Mexico. I've lived in the US, I've lived in France, I've lived in Japan, I've lived in Germany. And so all of these cultures have seeped into my storytelling in different ways. Loteria is a book that takes place in Mexico. It features ancient friends, life and death, who come into Oaxaca City one day to play a game called Loteria. So life and death, very handsome couple. The game Loteria is a little bit like bingo, except instead of numbers, you have pictures. And life and death choose a pawn who will either receive a long life if life wins the game, or will die if death wins the game. So as life and death play the game, they're flipping the cards, and all of the pictures on the cards are unfolding as events in our heroine's life. This is 11-year-old Clara, who's the pawn in the game, forcing her to make certain choices. She doesn't know any of this, and so you're left to wonder whether she has any choice, or if all of this is happening without, it's all determined by somebody else. So the story is actually a magical realist adventure, but it's exploring the theme of free will versus fate.
Ooh, I love that. All right, Darcie, you're up.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darcie Little Badger. And first, I have to start out with a disclaimer. I'm not wearing sunglasses indoors. These are my glasses, and the lenses turn dark when there's sunlight, so I'm facing a window. But normally they're clear. That's what my eyes look like. Anyway, I'm the author of 2 young adult fantasy books. The first is Away, and it tells the story of a teenage girl who has the ability to wake the ghosts of animals, including her ghost dog Kirby. And she actually solves the murder of her cousin over the course of this book. But my second book, which I'd like to talk about today, is A Snake Falls to Earth. And this is another fantasy novel that is told through the perspective of 2 different characters. The first is a teenage girl living in the near future version of Earth, and her name is Nina. And the second is actually a cottonmouth snake person. So his name is Ollie, and he has the ability to shift between a snake form and a more human-looking form. And he lives in this world of spirits and monsters and a whole bunch of very fantastic things. But his world is connected to our world in an interesting way. And in fact, these 2 characters, their stories collide near the middle of the book, and they end up helping each other save their friends and family. And I am Lipan Apache. We are an indigenous group that is actually native to Texas and northern Mexico. So my culture, specifically the storytelling culture, plays a big role in informing the structure and the stories of A Snake Falls to Earth. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. And Julian.
Yeah, those both sound incredibly dope.
Right?
Yeah, nah, I gotta make sure that those are like double check those are on my to be read list. What's up, y'all? My name is Julian Randall. I'm a living queer Black poet from Chicago, reporting to you live from West Garfield Park. I am the author of Pilar Ramirez and the Escape from Zafa, which is a coming out March 1st, 2022. So I'm not crying, you're crying. Maybe both of us are crying. We'll find out. So Pilar is a story that is very near and dear to my heart. It follows Pilar, who's 12 years old. That's her in the front of the cover. She's an aspiring documentary filmmaker trying to put together the mystery of what happened to her cousin during the Trujillato. If you're not familiar with that, the Trujillato was when Rafael Leonidas Trujillo took over the Dominican Republic for 31 years as its self-appointed president for life. During that time period, a lot of people disappeared, including Pilar's cousin, Natasha, who disappeared 50 years ago. So when Pilar finds out that there is a professor at the University of Chicago who's doing the same kind of research, she pops right down there, she hops on the L, hops back off. And as I'm sure many of you either have found out or will find out later in life, professor, office hours, not there. So she goes inside, she finds this folder that has her cousin's exact name and date of disappearance on it. And she thinks, this is it. This is the moment. I finally found the smoking gun, and all that's inside is a blank sheet of paper. But the second that she touches that blank sheet of paper, she is whooshed to the other side and finds herself on Zafa, which is this land of Dominican mythos and magic, which has been dominated by the Dominican boogeyman, bless you, by the Dominican boogeyman El Cuco, for the last 50 years in our world, but hundreds of years in theirs. So she has to find a way to find her power, find her history, and find her way back home alongside her cousin Natasha, who may or may not be in the prison of El Cuco himself.
That's awesome. And just for our kids here in Texas, we don't have subways. So can you clarify what you meant by hop on the L?
Yeah, nah. So there's a subway system that connects all of Chicago. So she just hops on the train that goes from her line all the way down to the south side, which is where University of Chicago is located.
Very cool. Thank y'all for sharing those. All right, our first question is a group question. So in your stories, there are many new worlds and lands and foreign characters and places. How do you come up with such interesting names and keep track of them all? So Julian, you went last, you can go first.
Word. Okay, so Zafa actually comes from a Dominican phrasing of basically like it's a positive force, a power of good luck that wards against evil spirits. And it comes from the power of telling, among other things, telling your own story. And ultimately, that's what Pilar is about. Pilar is a documentary filmmaker. She doesn't want to accept the line that she's been given all her life, which is a line that lots of people who live through the Trujillato experience, which is this person you love is gone. And there's no documentation as to where they went or when they're coming back or if they're coming back. So ultimately, Zafa is about finding the power within yourself to tell your story and the world that can be built from that.
Love that. Thank you. Darcie.
So the names, there's two different types of naming conventions in this book. The first in the human world, obviously these are names that we're more familiar with. The main character's name is Nina. And interestingly, my mom, that was almost a nickname for her when she was a child. So it's kind of a callback to that. And then you have these animal people. So I was kind of thinking, what would animal people parents name their children? So several of these are based on just probably what they saw as characteristics when the characters were very young. For example, there's a hawk named Brightest, and they just have this kind of radiant, open personality. So I was thinking their parents were probably like, oh, this is a good name for my kid. Then like the Coyote sisters are Risk and Rain, and one of them is very impulsive. Let's put it like that. So like her parents were probably like, this is a good name. So all of these names were just kind of based on these characters' personalities or just based on the whims of their parents. Like Ollie, the main character, his mom just liked the sound of that. So that's how they got their names.
Love that.
I love the names Risk and Rain. That's so, I don't know, musical. That's beautiful.
Carla, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so the names of my characters, so Clara is the main character, Esteban is her cousin. The way I usually choose my names, if I'm honest, is I just look at lists of names, of baby names, and I look at hundreds of lists until one resonates, and I'll actually plug and play. So I usually have a scene with a name that I chose, and then I'll put the name in there and see how it sounds, see if it fits the idea that I have of this character. Do I need it to be many syllables, or do I need it to be fewer syllables? So for instance, my son's name is Santiago, which is this very big and fancy name, you know, and so when we were choosing his name, we wanted it to have this feel for it. So that's how I choose the character names, is really just how they feel after looking at these lists. The names of the locations, though, obviously Oaxaca City is a real place, but there are two realms that take place in the fantasy world. One is called the Kingdom of Las Posas, and Las Posas is an actual place in Mexico. It's in the tropical jungle, and if anybody's read the book, or for anybody who does read it, it seems unreal when you read the world. You see the things that are described in there. It's like they don't exist, but they do. So if you Google Las Posas, Mexico, you will get these incredible visuals of this surrealistic sculpture garden that exists in the tropical jungle of Mexico. So that name was pretty easy. The other name, so the Kingdom of Las Posas is in this magical realm, this fantasy realm called Arrean. And that's actually my name, Arenas, with the words jumbled up. So it's a little bit of an Easter egg for any of my family members who are paying attention.
That's awesome. I thought that you were going to say Clara's name came from yours because you can jumble it up and get Carla.
Yeah, and it's funny, my dad thinks that I'm writing about myself in the story. And I had to tell him, no, this is not me. I was very deliberate about not trying to write characters based on anyone I know, because it gets really hard to hurt them in the story and have them go through dangerous situations if it's someone you know. So I'm superstitious enough not to name any characters after myself.
Oh, I love that superstition. I would have never thought of that. Julian, I was going to say my mom teases me all the time because she used to say that she was going to name me Pilar. And so when I was reading your book, and I was with my family, and they said, you know, they're always asking me what I'm reading. And I said, it's actually called Pilar Ramirez, and the Escape from Zafa. And they all laughed and said, it's about you, Pilar, because they call me Pilar. So we say it's really funny because now I live in Austin, where my name would be Pilar.
Yep.
All right.
Pilar was actually almost my name too.
That's awesome.
That was how I came up with it. And I was like, oh, word. Like, I mean, she strutted in and said, hi, I'm Pilar. And then kind of just decided that she was taking the wheel for the rest of the book, which I was fine.
So speaking of your characters just, you know, coming in and taking the wheel, for our students who are young writers, do you want to share how you develop your characters, or do you meet your characters, or do they like pop into your head and start talking to you? We'll start with Darcie this time.
Yeah, so in my latest book, there's quite a cast of characters, and they all have unique personalities compared to each other. And I kind of did that because I wanted a balance, like these characters almost they balance each other out. But also the way I develop characters is I just start writing. I don't really have an organized writing technique. Basically, I just start out, no outline, and just see where the story takes me. And a lot of times these characters just introduce themselves. And I don't know where they come from, but if they're fun to write, I keep them. So I do enjoy writing all of these characters. And this includes the more villainous characters. Like there's this alligator woman who is just very aggressive and fussy. And even her was fun to write, especially when she was going after my poor main character, Ollie, who he tries his best just to get along with everyone and just to survive. But oftentimes he encounters people who aren't the nicest. But yeah, that's my technique. If I enjoy writing something, I keep it. If I don't enjoy writing something, then they're thrown out of the book. And I imagine that a lot of these characters, like I'm not the type of person who will meet somebody and go, oh, I'm going to write about this person. But a lot of these features of the characters are almost general representations of certain type of human behavior and certain types of people that I meet. And then I just infuse my own influence into them.
Very cool. Thank you. Julian.
Yeah, I think it's a mix between characters who just stride in and just trusting them to have introduced the version of themselves that you need to be writing down. Because I think that can easily be one thing off the top, is just feeling like you have to edit, or well, obviously you have to edit, but feeling that you have to edit and like poke and prod. And sometimes the thing that came to you, that's what you're supposed to be doing. So a lot of it is learning how to trust that. I also watch a lot of TV. I watch a lot of TV. I read a lot of books, and sometimes I'll hear a voice keep going after a character has stopped talking. And typically, that is a sign of like, at least this is like an element of a character that I want to like keep trying to curate a mode to listen to. So it's almost, sometimes I make playlists of like what I think they would be interested in or reading. And also, as I've gotten older, astrology, just figuring out how their like various personalities start to fit together. Yeah, I'm working on something right now where I'm like, oh, word, this is really just the battle between one Virgo and another. I know how to do that.
So cool. Carla.
So very similarly to my two peers here, but so the Loteria started with this line that came into my head. I heard this narrator say, life sauntered into town on a wave of heat. And all of a sudden I had all these questions and I thought, life? The life? What are we talking about? And then of course, life's companion is death. And now I've got life and death in this town. And I'm wondering, why are they there? What are they doing? And you can tell the next line was the description of life and how dapper he looked in his suit, and he has a red handkerchief that's monogrammed. And so this character just appeared and had a story to tell. So that was sort of the origin of that. And then something interesting happened that resonates with Julian just said with Clara. As I wrote the story and I started to filter in, because it is a discussion of free will versus fate. I have a background in philosophy and I wanted to explore this concept of choice versus determinism. And so as I'm writing the story, I think I know where it's going. I think I know what I want Clara to do to get us to that point. And it just, I wrote myself into a conundrum that was the climax of the story, and I didn't know how to get out. And I realized I was forcing Clara to go somewhere she didn't want to go. And so it wasn't until I was willing to listen to her and release her, basically give her free will as a character, that she was able to take the story in a completely unexpected direction, surprised me in terms of the plot, resolved the question I had about free will. But it was being able to be attuned to the voice of the characters and step away from my role as the domineering author that I was trying to be.
That's an awesome story. And I have to tell you, when I read that first line in your book of life sauntered into town, I thought, who thinks of this? This is an amazing first line. It's so cool.
Well, and after, like when you hear these lines, and I think it's this idea of just listening to the playlist of the world, right? Of like the turn of a phrase or something that just piques your curiosity. For all of our fellow writers, go with it, right? Sometimes we're curious and we don't know why, but if we keep uncovering, we get to this nugget that turns out to be a beautiful gem of a story.
I love that. So speaking of, building your story, how do you incorporate diversity into your fantasy stories without having to satisfy a diversity quota? And we will start with Carla, since you went last.
Yeah, so I love this question. Diversity is such a complex topic. And I think in my case, I didn't want to be a diverse writer. I'm a Mexican writer. I wanted to write a story that was about me and my hometown and what it's like to be Mexican. And growing up in Mexico, my life was full of magical realism. My house had real chaneques in them. My abuelita, after she passed away, came to us in dreams. I mean, that was part of my life. So my goal in writing this story was immersing people in my life, where Clara is the norm. She's not diverse. She's not different. She's the main character, and everything that happens to her is because she's the protagonist, because that is the norm. And I was very deliberate about talking about the foods the way they are. I mean, they eat chapulines, they eat crickets. And, you know, that's in the story, and all of these things that are just part and parcel of being Mexican, and not painting them as like, wow, this is so special, it's so unique, it's so diverse, but rather this is normal. This is how it is to be Mexican. And just not really trying to force the diversity aspect, because I think we do an injustice by trying to force it. It's more about opening up a space where people can dive into an experience that's different from their own. And in that case, dive into the experience of being in Mexico.
I love that. And as someone who is Mexican, and many of my students are as well, I have to thank you for allowing my students to see themselves in books, especially in a time when so many people don't want that to happen. So thank you. Julian.
Word. Yeah, I've been thinking about this. And I think that I resonate a lot with what Carla was saying, insofar as I think that I didn't set out to do anything diverse. I wrote what the world had told me was diverse, but to me was just life, right? That ultimately I knew all of the characters in this book are Dominican, but that we also have this huge phantasmagoria, like diaspora situation going on, where there's Black Dominicanos and there's Mestizos Dominicanos, and there's all of these different folks, right? But to me, ultimately, just knowing that we all come from all these places, but we have this central thread. There's almost like there's a song that we all share. We're all part of it. We're all singing different elements of it. But that was ultimately that was ultimately what I was setting out to do, was to write a book of really tough, brilliant, creative Dominican women, because that's who I grew up idolizing. And then when you look at the history of the resistance against Trujillo, against dictatorship in DR, it is almost always a history of women standing up for themselves and standing up for the world around them. So that was the number one thing. And the number two thing was also just to really try and pursue characters who I saw as full people who could make me laugh, and people who could make me cry, and people who could make me incredibly frustrated. So putting all of those things together, you ultimately end up with characters who are reflections of people who you can do right by. And that was all I really set out to do.
Thank you. Darcie.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to reiterate what my fellow panelists had said, in that I really don't think about things like quotas or diversity when I'm writing. I more write about what I know. Obviously, the fantasy's invented, but these characteristics that are considered diverse. For example, the human character in The Snake Falls to Earth, you know, she's Lip-On, she's biracial, she's asexual. You know, that's just me. And the cast of characters, I think all but one are somewhere on that LGBTQ spectrum. And that is also me, because these past couple of years, especially, a lot of very difficult things have happened in my personal life. And of course, there's this added element of the pandemic. So I really sought out the comfort of my friend group. And a lot of A Snake Falls to Earth deals with themes of friendship and found families. And actually, my friend group is almost entirely people who are somewhere, would consider themselves LGBTQ. And also, I'm part of a writers group for POC and Indigenous writers. So I'm writing about my friends in a way. And one thing that's interesting, though, is in the past, when I was growing up, I never read about a Native character in fantasy or science fiction. And I mean, like, any Native character, not just Lip-On Apache. I certainly never read about Lip-On people anywhere. And as time has gone on, especially now, I'm seeing more and more books that are representing reality in that the people of this land, there is so much variation in terms of our cultures and in terms of our experiences. And I'm really starting to see that represented on the bookshelves in a higher frequency. So really what is often, considered, quotas or diversity and stuff, it's just a reflection of our reality that finally we're starting to see in our fiction, or at least the fiction that is available in our libraries and in our bookstores. Because as a friend of mine recently said, these stories have always been out there. They just haven't been accessible widely. And that is because of things like gatekeeping. And it's so refreshing to be able to read about many different people whose experiences are either different than mine or similar to mine in the case of Native writers, in the case of queer writers. And that's really cool.
I love that.
I
Yes,
wanted to
please.
just highlight something that I think both Darcie and Julian, you said, and needs to be emphasized so often, is that none of these are monolithic cultures, right? So I think one of the things we're trying to push back on is this idea that diversity means that here's this diverse character, and then you encapsulate all of it. But clearly that's not the case. So, I mean, it's impossible to be able to write about just one particular culture or group because of the tremendous variety that, the huge spectrum of all of it that is encompassed in that.
Sure.
Exactly. And speaking of how we're encompassing reality and trying to make a reflection of reality into your books, how did you decide, or where did you get the inspiration to make your book into a specific category? So in this instance, how did you decide to make your books a fantasy novel? And Darcie, you can start this time.
Yeah, my books, it's always been difficult to classify them in one of these categories. For example, A Snake Falls to Earth does have this strong fantasy element. I completely invented this secondary world. And there's things like world shaping, which is basically magic. But on the other hand, it takes place in the near future. And something that I really focus on are the impacts of climate change on this little home in Texas. So I guess that can almost be considered science fiction. And one really great category that people have been saying my work belongs to is indigenous futurism, which, as an explanation, oftentimes it's considered native sci-fi, but that's not really the case. It's more this type of art spanning writing and music and just all sorts of arts, visual arts, that recognize our past, our present, and our future, and these connections between all of them and us as Native people. So really what I do is I just write the story, and then I let people, classify them in any way that is helpful to them. But I gotta say, I am influenced by the books that I really love. And growing up, that was, the books in the fantasy and science fiction sections of the library. So that probably plays a big role too. I think that a lot of my work is going to be fantasy going forward.
Leanne.
All right. Yeah, I love this question. I think for me, it comes from a couple different directions. I'm going to try and speak really quickly. Number one was simply the fact that Pilar is 12. And as a result, I thought about where was I at 12 years old? We'd just been planning to see DR for the first time in my lifetime. And financially something came up, so we couldn't go. And so this space that I knew was a huge part of my identity, that was responsible for the first time that I ever saw my mother crying over a book by Julia Alvarez, In the Time of the Butterflies, which is if you haven't had a chance to read it, stunning portrayal of the life of the four Mirabal sisters who led the resistance against Trujillo before the tragic assassination of three of the sisters, right? I knew that there were a lot of answers and questions here, and I couldn't get to them physically. And when I asked my teachers about do you have any books on this? They said nothing in your age group. So alongside that, I was a huge fantasy nerd. I was a huge fantasy nerd as a kid. It was how, as a kid and also many times as an adult, I tried to reconcile something huge and massive going on, right? And I think that's also like a very Dominican instinct. When you look at the history of DR, it's also a history of the surreal. You think about Trujillo telling people, this is a man who grew up in 80 to 90, like 100-degree heat his whole life and managed to convince people that he didn't sweat. That's how much dictators need the myth of themselves, right? So when we start thinking about that, fantasy becomes less fantasy and more simply a reality that we forgot to write down or we refuse to write down.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, so off of that, Zafa became the space for Pilar to have this kind of reckoning with this family history, because I think that all great novels start with a question. And for me, the question was, all of these folks disappeared. What if we could get some of them back? So yeah.
That's awesome. That makes me think of, and I'm sure this is going to make our students think of the Thanos snap, where, you know, half our population disappears and then they come back.
Exactly.
Love that. Carla.
So I would say my book is magical realism and fantasy. And for those of you who aren't clear on the distinction, and I don't profess to be an expert, but this is how I separate them. So magical realism is seated in reality. So it's the ordinary day-to-day normal life, but there are these fantastical elements that are incorporated into reality. They're not treated as special. It's not unique. It's just part of being there. I referenced earlier that I grew up in a house that had chaneques, right? So chaneques are these little mythical spirits. They're nature protectors. And of course they were there. And it wasn't weird. It wasn't unusual that a book, you'd set it at your bedside table, and then the next day it would show up behind the toilet, of course. And, you know, earrings would go missing and they would show up in a pot under the tree, right? So growing up with this magical aspect to my day-to-day reality, I mean, that was magical realism. So writing in that genre came very naturally because I just was basically spilling out all of the things and memories that I had in my mind. Now, fantasy is a made-up world with made-up rules where anything goes. And so there's a whole lot of creative space to explore there. And in Loteria, there are both. So when the book starts off in Oaxaca City, there's this magical realist component to it. It's still Oaxaca City. It's still very ordinary. But of course, you have these characters, life and death, walking around town, and nobody bats an eye. It's very normal. Once you go into Ajrean and the Kingdom of Las Posas, where everything is made up and there are different rules to the world, that's fantasy. And I guess I would attribute that to the fact that I grew up with a family of storytellers / liars. So we're all always embellishing every aspect of our life. And so that embellishment part came very naturally as well. So this book was just, I can't imagine not writing in this genre because it's basically how I think and live every day. So it's pretty seamless to go into that kind of thinking.
Love that. Darcie.
Oh my gosh, I got so wrapped up on the other panel as well as the question,
right?
Specifically. Sorry, what was the question specifically? I was like,
where did you get the inspiration? And you've touched on this a little bit. And how did you decide to make your book a fantasy book?
Oh, I already answered this question. I was first.
That's right. I'm sorry. I was already thinking about the next question.
Oh, it's
so you've all
good.
talked about how your own experiences and your life and your families influence your books. And because of that, does that ever make you worry about how, you know, public reactions are going to be, especially in a time when so many books are being banned? So the question is, have there ever been times when you've wanted to express your feelings about something in your writing and you decided to censor yourself because you feared the public outcry or reactions to it? And Darcie, you can start for us.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, it's always, there's this aspect of being a writer. And by that, I mean publishing your writing, because like people can be writers and just keep those stories themselves and their families, and that's very legit. But like us, we're publishing our books and hopefully getting a lot of readers. And sometimes these include readers who don't like our books because of the types of characters that are in them. You know, not everyone is gonna enjoy reading about a Native character, and I can't really control that. And I think like it can be difficult sometimes, especially because a lot of these stories come from our heart and such personal things. But I grew up, I was bullied a lot, and um, when I came out, some of my family, not my parents, thank goodness, I was fortunate, but other extended members of my family, they weren't accepting of that. So I guess growing up, I experienced a lot of this before I started publishing books. So I had this shell that was developing, in that I realized that although there may be people who want to censor our voices, who are just cruel and hateful, there are a lot of people, a lot of young readers who need these stories, might see themselves reflected in these stories, and might be going through some of the things I went through as a young person. And gosh, it would have been great to have books where I could see myself and realize, there are people out there who do have compassion for me, and there's a community waiting. And thank goodness I found a community, especially after college. It was difficult going through high school, but then I met people, especially through the internet, that helps connect us. So yeah, these stories are important, and forget the haters. I don't even think about them anymore. I don't read reviews because I know a lot of them are going to be, not exactly helpful. But yeah, you definitely will encounter that. It's almost inevitable. And the way I see it, it's like, so what? Forget them.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm sorry that, that has happened to y'all and that people, we have awful people out there, but as a librarian, and now I'm saying I'm your librarian, I want you to know that you are always welcome in my library, and so are your books. So we just got our 5-minute warning, and there's one final question that I want to ask y'all, since this is almost our time is up. If you knew or heard that a teacher was going to use your book in their class, is there something that you would want to say to that teacher, or do you have any do's or don'ts for them? So Julian, you're up.
What would I want to say to them? Well, after the first 10,000 thank yous, I would probably want to say correct pronunciation of the characters' names. But after that, I would want to say that I hope that this book can be your own form of Safa. I hope that your kids can look at this book and see in Pilar or Carmen, her Siguapa best friend, or the Calipotes who lead everything, or La Bruja who always makes me laugh. I hope that in each of them, you see a different element of what it can be to know that the power you need was inside you all along. Whether you're a young reader or someone who's giving this book to a young person, just thank you from the bottom of my heart that I hope that every kid has an opportunity to feel that they're powerful.
Thank you. Carla.
So thank you, of course. I think that's great, Julian. Also, call me. I would love to talk to your students. I have a great presentation where we do free will discussions, and we draw and we talk about alebrijes. But really, the question of free will versus fate is such a big question. And I think sometimes we think kids are too little to be able to think the big questions, and they're not. You guys are not too little for any of these questions. So ask the big questions. Think about it. Ask yourself whether it makes sense. Do you think you have free will or not? Question the book. I'm not trying to give you an answer. I'm trying to get you to ask questions and think about it. So disagree with me. Feel free to disagree. Tell me if you didn't like the ending. But explore the book, right? Lose yourself in the story, but also in the big ideas. Have the courage to have those big ideas, because you guys are totally capable of handling it.
Thank you. And our last response will be from Darcie.
Yes, reiterating, definitely thank you. I love when classes read my book. It's just, it makes me so happy and so grateful. And also there's a couple things, my books are about Lipan people. And I guess the first thing is it's not exactly a manual about what it means to be Lipan because they're fantasy books. We unfortunately aren't able to raise the ghosts of animals. I would have loved that, but no. But on the other hand, they are about a people, my people who, you know, our story is still continuing. So we're very much, you know, alive and doing our thing in the 21st century. And I just got to raise an example. For example, at the end of Elatsoe, I briefly mentioned this Lipan burial ground in Presidio. But at the time I wrote that, it was being, you know, it was essentially falling apart. You know, people were taking the burial stones. But this year, Presidio actually gave this land to my tribe, and now we're in the process of protecting it and putting a gate around it. And there was a ceremony when the stones were returned. So these books are about an ongoing, you know, we are people who are alive today. And thank you so much again for reading them.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your school day as part of North Texas Teen Book Festival.
No doubt. Thanks so much, y'all.